It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October when Margaret Talbot walked into Le Ruisseau, the kind of restaurant that didn't need to advertise. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, the place shimmered with white linen tablecloths, polished silverware, and the kind of hushed ambience that made ordinary people speak in whispers. It was the kind of place where people weren't shown menus, they were shown off. Margaret entered alone, a canvas tote over her shoulder, a navy wool coat fastened neatly against the chill. Her shoes were practical. Her hair was tied back in a low bun. No jewelry, no brand-name handbag, just a well-worn face with the calmness of someone who had seen far more than the room could possibly guess. She approached the host's stand quietly, waiting patiently while the young man in a sleek black suit ignored her for nearly 2 minutes. He was texting, laughing quietly at something on his screen. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited. When he finally looked up, his smile was automatic, until it landed on her. "Yes?" he asked, with all the warmth of an ATM. "I'd like a table," she said. His eyes moved over her. The coat, the shoes, the canvas tote with a faint coffee stain. He didn't ask if she had a reservation. He didn't ask for a name. "We're fully booked." She smiled softly. "Oh, I called ahead. I was told there were openings for lunch." "We don't do walk-ins without reservations," he said, flatly. "I didn't walk in," she said calmly. "I called at 10 a.m. spoke with someone named Lily." He sighed. "Name? Margaret Talbot." He typed something into the screen in front of him. His brow furrowed slightly. "You're not in the system," he said. "May I speak with Lily then?" "She's busy." At that moment, a well-dressed couple entered behind her. The man wore a deep burgundy suit. The woman's heels clicked like applause. Without missing a beat, the host lit up and greeted them by name, showing them to a table near the window. Margaret watched, still calm. But something behind her eyes shifted, something old, something tired. The host returned. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." There was no commotion, no shouting. Margaret simply blinked. "Leave? We have a dress code. And frankly, this isn't the kind of place you'd feel comfortable in. There's a cafe down the block that's a better fit." A woman at the nearby bar turned her head. A server froze mid-step. No one said anything, but the silence was loud. "I see," Margaret said quietly. She turned. She walked out. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. She didn't even look back. She simply adjusted her coat, walked to the curb, and pulled out her phone. The sky above was the kind of muted gray that promised early snow. Across the street, a man in a suit tossed his cigarette into the gutter and climbed into a chauffeured town car. Margaret stood there for a moment. She typed a note into her phone. One sentence. "Find out who owns 231 East 61st Street. Then she put the phone away. She walked 5 blocks to a modest diner that smelled like real food and looked like it hadn't changed since 1984. She ordered a grilled cheese and a bowl of tomato soup. No one asked for her name. No one cared about her coat. The waitress called her sweetheart and topped off her coffee twice. When she left a $200 tip under the sugar jar, she didn't wait for thanks. She wasn't angry. She wasn't humiliated. She was awake. Again. That night, Margaret sat in her apartment on the Upper West Side, an understated, book-lined pre-war flat she had lived in for 23 years. She opened her laptop. She wasn't on social media. She wasn't interested in public outrage or viral justice. That wasn't her language. But real estate? That she understood. She looked up the building. The restaurant occupied the entire first floor. Above it, 4 stories of mixed-use commercial space. Outdated interiors. Underutilized square footage. Long-term tenants, but no active development plan. Owned by a holding company with a name she recognized because she had sold it to them, anonymously, 7 years prior. Funny how the world came back around. She made 2 phone calls. The first, to her lawyer. The second, to a man in Queens who owed her a favor and knew how to move quickly. The next morning, the process was already in motion. But not for revenge. Margaret wasn't interested in that. She wasn't interested in embarrassing a rude host or calling attention to snobbery dressed in linen. She was interested in making sure that the next time someone like her walked through that door, no one would dare measure their worth by their coat, their shoes, or the silence they carried with dignity. Because what the host, and the restaurant, and the world didn't know yet was that Margaret Talbot had built half the skyline behind them. She had funded the tech that powered their reservations. She had invested early in the platform that handled their payment system. She had been the silent partner in two of the largest urban development projects in Manhattan over the last decade. And she had done it all in cardigans. Not for invisibility, but for focus. And now that focus had turned toward them. 2 days. That's all it would take. Margaret Talbot didn't become a quiet millionaire overnight. She didn't inherit wealth, marry into it, or stumble upon some lucky IPO. What she had, she earned, one invoice, one grit-fueled hour at a time. And every dollar, every property, every system and structure bearing her signature, lived quietly in places most people never looked. That was how she liked it. That was how she had survived. She had grown up in Buffalo, New York, in a neighborhood where winters buried the streets and ambition melted like snow on asphalt. Her father had worked in a steel plant until his back gave out. Her mother cleaned houses until her fingers curled in from arthritis. There were no college banners on the wall, no promises of making it big, just meals made from cans and heat rationed by the hour. But even as a girl, Margaret noticed things. Noticed how systems worked, how money moved, how people looked at you differently when you wore secondhand shoes. She read quietly while others gossiped, calculated numbers in her head while her cousins chased boys. She learned early. If the world isn't built for you, learn how it's built and build your own piece of it. She went to community college at night, worked at a call center during the day. Data entry mostly. Minimum wage. Fluorescent lights that never flickered off. But while the others clicked keys like they were waiting to be released, Margaret studied the back-end systems. How databases moved information, how algorithms sorted customers, how little tweaks created big efficiencies. At 25, she pitched her first software module, a basic but smart automation tool that cut call times by 18%. Her boss laughed and told her to stay in her lane. So she stayed quiet, took the code with her, built it on her own time, and sold it under a pseudonym 6 months later to a mid-sized telecom firm in Boston. They never knew it was her. She used the money to move to New York City, not to live in luxury, but to disappear into its noise. She rented a small apartment, wore black sweaters from thrift stores, and listened. Always listened. By the time she turned 35, Margaret had quietly sold 4 software modules, 2 analytics systems, and had investments in 5 startups, none of which ever knew her name. She refused interviews, declined photos, let other people stand on the stage while she watched from the wings, collecting equity, dividends, and insight. She learned how to invest, not just in companies, but in land, buildings, infrastructure. While others chased trends, she followed utility, bought old laundromats and converted them into co-working spaces, funded minority-owned businesses before it became fashionable. She read city council notes, tracked zoning changes, and understood the value of a corner before the developers did. She was there before Williamsburg turned into art galleries, before Harlem turned into high-rises, and always just under the radar. People said her portfolio was owned by a consortium, a fund, a faceless group. That suited her fine. She didn't need them to see her. She needed them to underestimate her. Because when they underestimated her, they showed her who they really were. That was the strategy, and it worked. By the time she was 50, Margaret was worth more than some hedge funds. But she still walked to the grocery store, still rode the subway, still wore the same wool coat she bought at a flea market in 2003. Not because she couldn't afford better, but because it didn't occur to her that she needed to. She spent her money on ideas, not image, on opportunities, not optics. But as she sat in her apartment 2 days after the restaurant incident, reviewing documents and preliminary building transfer options, she realized something had shifted. Not in her, but in the world. There was a time when being underestimated was useful, strategic. But now it felt like permission. A permission the world had given itself to humiliate those it couldn't immediately label. That young host at the restaurant didn't just make a mistake. He made a declaration. That a woman without diamonds, without heels, without visible signs of wealth, must be undeserving of courtesy, of space, of respect. It wasn't about her. It was about every woman who'd been sized up and dismissed in an instant. And for the first time in decades, Margaret felt something stirring. Not rage, not even pride, but duty. She had stayed quiet long enough. She called her lawyer again. Yes, he asked, surprised by the second call in 24 hours. Close the deal. All cash. Full acquisition. I don't want a share, I want the title. You're sure? I've never been more sure. And the tenants? They stay. Rent's frozen. No one gets displaced. And the restaurant? I'll visit them tomorrow. Let's see how they treat a new landlord in a cardigan. Her lawyer chuckled. You really are the quiet storm, Margaret. No, she said. I'm just a mirror. They don't like what they see in it. That night, Margaret didn't sleep much. She walked through her apartment, ran her fingers along the spines of old books, brewed tea in a chipped mug, and thought about her mother. How she had once been turned away from a beauty parlor because she didn't look right. How that memory had never left Margaret. Now, maybe, she could make sure no one had to live it again. The next morning, she dressed the same way she always did. Same coat, same shoes, same calm. But this time, she carried something different, not in her hands, but in her intention. She wasn't walking into a restaurant anymore. She was walking into a lesson. And this time, the world would be forced to listen. Margaret arrived outside 231 East 61st Street precisely at 10:47 a.m. She always preferred to be early, not to impress, but to observe. The street was calm, the city's energy muffled by the softness of a mid-autumn morning. The awning of Le Ruisseau cast a neat shadow across the sidewalk, like a velvet curtain drawn between two worlds, theirs and hers. She stood across the street for a moment, unnoticed. Watched a black SUV unload a pair of clients in tailored suits. Watched the hostess greet them with a trained smile. Watched the maitre d', the same man from 2 days ago, pace confidently, checking his watch, his posture upright with the practiced ease of someone who thought control was permanent. He didn't know yet. He didn't know that the papers had been signed at 9:12 a.m., that the building they occupied was now wholly owned by the woman he had turned away. He didn't know that while he was perfecting his tone of condescension, Margaret had been closing escrow with no debt, no investors, and no need for explanation. That was the beauty of silence. It let people tell you who they really were. She crossed the street, not with a strut, but with steadiness. Each step was deliberate, rooted, earned. She pushed open the door to Le Ruisseau without hesitation. The smell of white truffle and buttered asparagus greeted her, a perfume of exclusivity that had once been weaponized to suggest belonging, or the lack thereof. The hostess was new, younger, wide-eyed. She looked up, a little unsure. Good morning, Margaret said. I believe someone from management is expecting me. A name. Margaret Talbot. There was a pause. A flicker of recognition passed over the hostess's face. She'd heard the name, maybe seen it on an internal email. Of course. Please wait one moment. She vanished behind the podium. Margaret waited near the entrance, calm, hands folded in front of her. She didn't need to scan the room. She already knew what kind of people were here. She had sat on the other side of their deals, bought their companies, rejected their funding offers, observed their insecurities behind their cocktails. What she was about to do wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about shifting the ground beneath them, quietly, irrevocably. The maitre d' appeared moments later. It was the same man. His name tag said Philip. He smiled with the rehearsed hospitality of someone forced to play nice. He didn't recognize her at first. Ms. Talbot, he said, his tone cautious. Thank you for coming. She simply nodded. He gestured toward a private dining room near the back, once reserved for celebrity clients and hush-hush deals. Now, it would serve a different purpose. A table had been set for two, water poured, napkins folded with militant precision. A quiet luxury, wrapped in expectation. Margaret sat. Philip remained standing. I understand you had a meeting scheduled with our owner, he began, unsure of the words as he said them. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I did. There was a pause. He cleared his throat. Unfortunately, Mr. Varga is currently traveling. No longer relevant, she replied, her voice even. Pardon, I'm no longer meeting with the owner of the restaurant, she said gently. I'm meeting with the tenant of a building I now own. Philip blinked. His lips parted slightly. The blood left his face. I'm sorry. There's no need, Margaret said calmly, reaching into her bag. She placed a single folder on the table. These are the documents. Deed transfer. Title. Lease agreements. It's all standard. Your legal team will receive the official notifications this afternoon. He stared at her, his body frozen, but his mind sprinting. I don't understand, he finally managed. Margaret opened the folder, slid one page forward, pointed to her name on the deed. You will, she said. The silence that followed was dense, not awkward. Sacred. The kind of silence that rewrites a room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't remind him of what he'd done. She didn't list the ways he'd failed. She let the silence do it for her. Because people remember what you say far less than how you made them feel. And in that silence, Margaret let him feel the weight of his assumptions. Let him feel what it meant to misread a life based on shoes, to ignore dignity in favor of image, to turn away a woman who could afford to buy the ground beneath his feet and still chose not to embarrass him. Philip finally sat, hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "That's the problem," she replied. "You didn't think you had to. I was wrong. Yes. I treated you like you didn't belong. You made sure I didn't." There was no anger in her voice. Just clarity, clean and surgical. Philip swallowed hard. "Are you closing the restaurant?" Margaret shook her head. "No. The restaurant will stay." He looked confused. "But why?" "Because not everything needs to be destroyed to be reimagined." She stood then, collected the folder, slipped it back into her tote. "From now on," she added, "you will treat everyone who walks through that door like they could be the person who owns the building. Because sometimes they are." She left him there, not humiliated, but awakened. Margaret didn't gloat, didn't call the press. She didn't leak the story. She didn't tweet about her triumph. She went home, made tea, read a few pages of an old novel, and slept better than she had in months. Over the next 2 days, she worked quietly with her architects. The upper floors of the building had been languishing in disuse for years. Cracked paint, outdated wiring, storage closets turned into offices that no one used. Margaret had a new vision, not for profits, but for purpose. She would convert the second and third floors into spaces for local entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses, immigrant-owned pop-ups, small-batch food startups priced out of the city's bloated rent markets. The fourth floor? A culinary training studio. For free. For anyone who had ever been told they didn't look right for fine dining. The roof? A greenhouse. Not for status. For herbs and vegetables that would supply the restaurant kitchen downstairs. And Le Ruisseau? It would stay, but its culture would change. She met with the head chef personally, sat across from him in the same private room, asked him questions no landlord ever asked. What did he want to cook that the current menu wouldn't allow? Who did he want to hire but couldn't get past the image-conscious owners? He was stunned. She listened, and she left him with a single instruction. Cook food that matters. That was it. No show, no press release, no name etched into the building's facade. Just quiet power, realigned for impact. 2 days after the transfer, a woman walked into Le Ruisseau wearing a wool coat and a canvas tote. The host greeted her politely, offered her water while she waited, asked her if she'd like to sit by the window. He didn't recognize her, but he respected her, and that was enough. Margaret sat, watching the light filter through the tall glass, watching people walk by, some in $1,000 coats, others with bags from the dollar store. All of them people, all of them worthy. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret let herself smile. Not because she'd won, but because something old had been repaired. Silently, completely. The city didn't stop turning when Margaret bought the building. The subway still screeched through tunnels. Office lights still flickered on at dawn. But in one corner of the Upper East Side, something imperceptible had shifted, an invisible fault line realigning beneath a restaurant that had, for years, been more about exclusion than cuisine. It started slowly, as these things always do. The staff at Le Ruisseau noticed the first change when the new kitchen shipment arrived. Not truffle oil or imported saffron, but bulk flour, heritage tomatoes, and fresh kale from a rooftop garden no one remembered being installed. It hadn't made the local news. No social media announcement. Just soil, sun, and a new rhythm. The new produce manager, an immigrant named Esteban, didn't own a resume. Only a handwritten letter of recommendation from the chef who'd taught him everything he knew in Oaxaca. He'd been rejected by 8 restaurants for lack of professional experience. Margaret hired him without an interview. He now ran the greenhouse like a conductor leads an orchestra. Next came the people. They started showing up in small numbers. Older couples from the neighborhood who once passed by the restaurant's heavy wooden doors without ever daring to enter. They were greeted now not with indifference, but welcome. Hostesses stopped scanning outfits and started asking how people were. Servers made eye contact. The energy changed. It didn't happen overnight. It happened because someone quietly rewrote the rules. Margaret returned to the restaurant on a Thursday afternoon. Not for a meeting, not to assert ownership, but simply to be present. She walked in the same way she always had. Coat buttoned. No makeup. Bag over her shoulder. She was greeted by a young woman who smiled brightly and said, "Miss Talbot, welcome back." There was no fanfare, no tension, just respect. She was shown to a table by the window, the same window she'd once seen from the sidewalk, where others had dined while she was asked to leave. The irony wasn't lost on her. But this time, she didn't sit in judgment. She sat in observation. The maitre d', Philip, was no longer working there. After the purchase, he'd requested a transfer to a different location within the restaurant group. Not out of spite. Margaret hadn't asked him to go, but because, in his own words, "I need to learn how to treat people before I lead them." He had left quietly, without drama, and with a handwritten note addressed to her. "You taught me more in silence than most leaders do in speeches. I wasn't just wrong, I was blind. Thank you for the mirror." Margaret kept the note in a drawer. She didn't collect apologies, but she honored sincerity. The server that day was named Camille. Young, fresh out of a community college program for hospitality management. She moved with confidence, not the brittle kind that comes from proving yourself, but the real kind that grows when someone believes in you before you do. Camille told Margaret the specials, explained the locally grown ingredients, and recommended the braised eggplant with rosemary potatoes. "I'll have whatever you think is made with care," Margaret replied. Camille smiled. "Then you'll love it all." The food came hot, unfussy, nourishing. It was the kind of meal Margaret remembered from her grandmother's table, when love was measured in seconds served and not five-star reviews. While she ate, she noticed a family at the next table. Mother, father, 2 kids, the youngest bouncing her feet off the edge of the chair. A small birthday cake arrived. The whole restaurant clapped. Margaret joined softly, her hands gentle, as if applauding not just the child, but the moment itself. That's what the place had become. Not a fortress, but a gathering. She stayed after the meal, sipping coffee, speaking with Camille about her future. The girl wanted to open a cafe one day, a place with soft chairs and big windows. Margaret listened intently, then handed her a business card, not with her name, but with an email address and a short phrase. "Let's build something." No promises, just possibility. Later that evening, she walked upstairs to check on the progress of the second-floor renovations. It had been 6 weeks since she'd purchased the building. Walls had been torn down, paint scraped, electrical rewired. Now, open rooms stood bathed in natural light, tables waiting to be filled with blueprints, dreams, and coffee mugs. The co-working space was nearly ready. The first tenants would arrive next week. 5 women running micro-businesses from their living rooms until now. A graphic designer, a virtual assistant, a handmade candle maker, a grant writer, and a therapist offering sliding scale sessions for single mothers. None of them had ever set foot in Le Ruisseau before. All of them now had keys. The 3rd floor was next. Margaret envisioned an incubator space, not for tech, but for trust. A room where women could pitch ideas without jargon, where they could speak plainly, fail boldly, and not be penalized for doing so. She had no desire to sit on a panel, no interest in being the face of anything. She would simply make the space, then step aside. That was always her model. She built ladders and never stood at the top of them. That night, Margaret walked home instead of calling a car. The breeze carried a whisper of autumn, and the city soundscape felt less harsh than usual. She passed a group of teens sitting on the church steps, laughing over something on a phone. One of them wore a hoodie that read "Rethink Power." She smiled. The building was just a building, but what happened inside it now had weight. She remembered her mother again, how she'd once said, "The world will always try to shrink you. Your job is to not drink the potion." Margaret had never drunk it, but she had watched others do it. Watched brilliant women fold themselves smaller and smaller just to fit through doors never meant for them. That was why she never changed her coat. It was her armor against assumption. And now, maybe, a signal. That power didn't always have to arrive wearing heels or shouting from stages. Sometimes it arrived quietly, sat at the back, listened, and then rebuilt everything in its own image. By the following month, word had spread, not about the buyout, but about what was happening inside the building. Not through press releases, through people. One woman told her sister. A barista told a regular. A retired teacher brought in her niece. Margaret never advertised. She didn't need to. People find light when they're used to the dark. They always do. And Le Ruisseau? It earned a new nickname from the neighborhood. They called it the second door. Not because there was an actual second entrance, but because, for the first time, people who were once left outside felt like they could walk in. By spring, the building Margaret Talbot bought no longer resembled what it once was. Not in layout, not in culture, and certainly not in spirit. What had once been just another polished address on East 61st Street, all pretense and reservation-only elitism, had become something far more extraordinary, an ecosystem built not on status, but on stories. On the second floor, the co-working space buzzed gently. The click of keyboards, the low hum of printers, the occasional rustle of papers, and laughter, real, full-bellied laughter, from women who'd once felt out of place in every professional room they walked into. Here, they weren't just allowed. They belonged. The third floor had taken shape into Margaret's quiet dream, an incubator not for capital, but for courage. No pitch decks, no jargon, just voices. Women sat in circles with notebooks, voice recorders, cups of peppermint tea, sharing ideas and finding allies. In one room, a mother of four mapped out a plan for a childcare app. In another, a retired nurse taught others how to start a private in-home elder care business. They didn't call it a startup. They called it survival. But Margaret knew it was the same thing. She never named the program after herself. There was no Talbot Institute, no signature plaque in gold letters. In fact, most who used the building still didn't know who Margaret truly was. They knew her only as the quiet lady who asks good questions. And that was how she preferred it. But her influence? Unmistakable. Downstairs, Le Ruisseau was more alive than it had ever been. The menu had shifted, subtly. Still elegant, but now rooted in comfort. No more dishes that read like crossword puzzles. Instead, food that told a story. Short ribs marinated in Puerto Rican spices, sourdough baked by a Syrian refugee who once sold bread from a food truck. Camille, the young waitress, now managed the floor. She trained the new hires not just on service, but on eye contact, on listening. And every Friday, without fail, Margaret came in at noon. Same old coat, same calm. She sat at the same window table, ordered the same rotating lunch special, and watched the world pass by, not as an outsider, but as its quiet architect. It had been nearly 6 months since the day they turned her away. No one spoke about it anymore. No articles had been written. No videos had been shared. But the story lived in whispers, a kind of urban folklore. The tale of the woman they tried to dismiss, who came back not with revenge, but with renewal. The staff called her the turnaround. She never corrected them, because that's what she had become. And not just for a building. For everyone who'd ever felt invisible, ignored, assessed, and rejected by those who thought value was only skin deep. One Friday, as the first warm breeze of April slipped through the city, Margaret received a visitor. She was sitting in her usual spot, a notebook open in front of her, scribbling something in soft pencil. A young woman approached, no more than 22, dressed in jeans and a faded blouse. She looked nervous, holding a letter in both hands like it might dissolve. "Miss Talbot?" she asked. Margaret looked up and offered the kind of smile that puts storms to sleep. "Yes. Hi. I'm sorry to interrupt. I've been coming to the workshops upstairs. I run a tutoring service for ESL students. And well, you don't know me, but I heard the story. About you. About how you bought the building." Margaret said nothing, just nodded slightly. "I didn't believe it at first," the girl continued. "I thought, no way someone that calm could do something that powerful. But then I saw the greenhouses. And the scholarships. And I realized maybe that's what power really looks like." She handed over the letter. Margaret took it gently, eyes scanning the handwriting. It wasn't polished. It was raw. The words weren't trying to impress. They were trying to connect. "I wrote this," the young woman added, "because I wanted to say thank you for making a space where someone like me isn't judged by my accent or my shoes." Margaret folded the letter slowly. "What's your name?" "Raina." "That's a strong name." The girl flushed. "My mom named me after her grandmother. She always said we come from fighters." "You do," Margaret said. "And now you build." The girl left, and Margaret sat there a long time, watching people pass by the window. Men in suits, women in scrubs, couples with strollers, teens with earbuds. All living their lives unaware of the space around them that had been carefully rewritten by the woman in the cardigan. That night, Margaret walked through the building after hours. The lights were dimmed. The scent of bread from the downstairs kitchen still lingered. On the walls of the third floor, new murals had appeared, painted by local artists who'd been gifted space in exchange for a few hours of mentorship. The paintings were bold, vibrant. One showed a woman standing in a windstorm, her coat wrapped tight, her eyes closed but her feet planted firm. In her office, Margaret sat at her desk, an old table from her very first apartment. She didn't use a leather chair. She didn't have a view of the skyline. What she did have was a box, plain, wooden, hand-carved, filled with letters, notes, drawings. Messages from people like Raina. Messages that reminded her why she had come back, why she had bought the building, why silence had never meant weakness. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. To whoever finds this, you may never know my name. That's all right. What matters is that you know your own worth. This space, this building, it isn't a monument. It's a beginning. It was built from what people overlooked. Small voices, practical shoes, soft hands, quiet minds. They told us power was loud, that you had to shout, flash, posture. But real power? It listens, it waits, and then it moves the ground beneath everything. If you ever feel like you don't belong, sit a little taller. Someone already fought for your seat. And if they ever ask you to leave the room, on the building, empty. She folded the letter and slipped it into the box, placing it beneath the others. No plaque would bear her name, but her message would outlive stone and steel. It would live in the way Camille trained her staff, in the way Raina spoke to her students, in the way women across the city gathered their courage, put on their coats, and walked into rooms that once would have closed their doors. They would remember not what Margaret said, but how she made them feel. And the world, if it paid close enough attention, would never forget that a simple woman was once kicked out of a fancy restaurant and chose, instead of revenge, to change everything it stood for. Silently, irrevocably, forever.